The first mortar rounds hit Firebase Argonne in the morning, when the Marines on that hill were still trying to turn a rough piece of ground back into a working position. They had only reoccupied it the day before. That matters. A firebase looks organized on a map, a perimeter, a command post, fighting holes, a landing zone, men assigned to sectors. But on the ground, especially after a hard move into an old position, order has to be rebuilt by hand. Radios have to be where people can use them. Ammunition has to be where it belongs. Men have to know which hole is theirs. Wounded men from the previous day still have to be moved. Somebody is always carrying something from one side of the hill to the other. And then the first rounds came in. There was no long warning period. No neat moment when every Marine was already behind cover and looking outward. The base had to become defensive while it was already being hit. That is the problem in this story. Not whether the Marines at Argonne knew they were in a dangerous place. They knew that before they landed. The problem was that danger arrived while the position itself was still becoming a position. Firebase Argonne sat on high ground northwest of Quezon, close to the Laotian border. The Marines had used the site before and then left it. In March 1969, during Operation Purple Martin, they went back. The return was not quiet. On March 20th, a helicopter carrying a reconnaissance team was hit as it approached the hill and came down on the position. The men who survived the landing found themselves in a fight almost immediately. Company D, 1st Battalion, 4th Marines moved in to secure the hill, fighting through enemy positions around the old firebase. So when the morning of March 21st arrived, Argonne was not a settled rear area, waking up to another day. It was a place that had just been taken back. That meant the first lost option came fast. The Marines could not finish organizing the base and then deal with the shelling. They had to do both at once. If you have ever seen photographs of those hilltop fire bases, it is easy to imagine them as fixed forts. Sandbags, timber, dirt, antennas, guns. But those pictures hide the amount of movement required to keep one of those places working. The defensive position was never just the bunkers. It was the people moving between them. A radio operator carrying a handset where the commander needed it. A corpsman checking a man who had been hurt the day before. A runner crossing open ground with a message. A Marine who had left his fighting hole for water. Another man trying to get equipment under cover before the next helicopter came in. Morning made all of that visible. Then, incoming fire made every trip across the hill a new decision. At first, the job was basic. Get men under cover, account for who was where, keep the command structure talking, and work out what part of the position had been hit. You do not need a technical lecture on mortars to understand what that did to a firebase. The important fact is simpler. The men on Argonne did not control when the next impact would arrive, so every task that normally took 30 seconds might now have to wait, change route, or be handed to somebody already closer. That is how a routine place becomes a combat place. Not all at once, piece by piece. One man reaches his position. Another still has to cross the open part of the hill. The command post gets a report from one sector and loses contact with another. Somebody asks where a missing Marine is, and the answer is not immediately available. The base starts rebuilding itself around the shelling. Argonne was not a large city of tents and buildings. It was a remote high ground position where the terrain itself limited what could be placed where. That made the command post more important, not less. It was where information from different pieces of the position came together. And on that morning, the command post became part of the problem. Enemy mortar fire hit the Marine command post. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel George Sargent, was killed along with 3 other Marines. That single event changed the shape of the morning. Up to that point, the problem had been, get the firebase back into fighting order while rounds are landing. Now the base had to do that without the man who had been commanding the battalion from that position. Responsibility moved. Messages that had been going to one man now had to go somewhere else. Decisions that had been his now belonged to someone who had not expected to inherit them that morning. That is the part of a mortar attack that a photograph cannot show. A crater is easy to photograph. A broken chain of responsibility is not. Yet that may change a unit faster than any damaged piece of equipment. The Marines still had sectors to hold. They still had wounded to move. They still had to watch the approaches to the hill. They still had to keep communications working. The base did not get to stop because the command post had been hit. There is a practical side to losing a command post that does not show up in casualty figures. People still have to know who is answering which radio. Somebody has to decide what information matters first. Somebody has to tell the next level of command what the firebase needs. Somebody has to separate a report that changes the fight from one that can wait 5 minutes. None of that requires a dramatic order. Most of it is men doing jobs they already know, except now the familiar person at the center of those jobs is gone. That kind of disruption can spread quietly. One sector may be waiting for information that another sector thinks has already been passed. A runner may arrive at a bunker looking for an officer who has moved. A radio operator may know the net is alive, but not know who now owns the decision on the other end. The firebase still looks like the same hill from the air. On the ground, the human connections inside it have changed. And while those connections are being rebuilt, the ordinary needs do not stop. Water still has to move. Batteries still run down. Men who have been awake since the previous day still get tired. A position that took damage still needs attention. Nobody gets to declare the routine suspended until tomorrow. The routine is what has to be rebuilt, because the routine is how the place keeps functioning once the first burst of movement is over. That is why the morning at Argonne lasts longer as a story than the first impact. The mortar round is an event. The consequences are a sequence. Every few minutes, something that had seemed settled becomes a question again. Who has command? Which men can be moved? Whether the landing area can be used? Whether a sector is fully manned? Whether the next helicopter can come in? Whether the source of the fire can be dealt with from the hill or requires Marines to move out into the surrounding terrain? The firebase keeps changing, even though it has not moved an inch. If anything, the need for order became more urgent. And this is where the story stops being about surprise. By now, the Marines knew they were under attack. Men had reached fighting positions. The base was reacting. The first shock had been absorbed. From the outside, you could almost say the firebase had recovered its shape. That is the midpoint. Because once the position begins to function again, a second problem appears. Now, they have to move the wounded, and the enemy is still watching the same hill. Medical evacuation from a remote firebase sounds simple when reduced to one sentence. Bring in a helicopter and take the wounded out. But a helicopter has to approach the same ground that has already been under fire. Men have to move the wounded from cover to the landing area. The crew has to know where to come in. The base has to keep doing everything else while that movement happens. The landing zone becomes a place where several needs collide. Speed, exposure, communication, space, and the fact that the wounded cannot always move themselves. At Argonne, the shelling did not simply end when the first casualties were taken from the command post. More mortar fire came in during the evacuation effort. 3 more Marines were killed. That changed the morning again. The obvious solution to the first problem, move the wounded out, had created another period when men had to leave cover and use a predictable piece of ground. The firebase could defend itself and still remain vulnerable while trying to take care of its own people. That is the kind of contradiction veterans tend to recognize immediately. The safest place for a man may be behind cover. The job may require him to leave it. A position can be organized and still have one task that forces movement through the part of the base everybody would rather avoid. There is nothing abstract about that. It is a man looking across a short distance and realizing the distance has changed because rounds are still coming in. A radio call that would normally be routine becomes important because the helicopter needs a clear picture of the ground. A corpsman who had been working in one place now has to move with the casualty. A Marine who finally reached his assigned position may have to leave it because somebody else needs help. That is how a firebase rebuilds itself under pressure, not by returning to the exact plan from 5 minutes earlier, by accepting that the plan has already changed. One of the strongest things about the Argonne story is that the hill itself never gives the Marines an easy answer. It is high ground, which is why they want it. It is exposed, which is why the enemy can keep putting pressure on it. It gives observation. It also gives the enemy a known place to aim at. Every advantage has a cost attached to it, and the men living there do not experience those advantages as map symbols. They experience them as chores, where the water is, where the radio is, how far it is to the next bunker, whether the landing area is usable, which route across the position keeps a man behind the most cover for the longest time. Those little practical questions are the real architecture of a firebase. If you served on one of those hilltop positions in I Corps, I would like to hear one very specific thing from you. What ordinary morning job became the biggest nuisance when incoming started? Coffee, water, radio checks, moving chow, getting to a bunker, whatever it was. Put the firebase and year in the comments if you remember them. Those are the details the official histories usually cannot preserve. There is another reason Argonne matters. The Marines did not simply occupy the hill, suffer the mortar fire, and leave the story there. The mortar positions themselves remained a problem. Company C was ordered toward Argonne. Company A moved west in an effort to silence the enemy mortars. The fight around the firebase continued for days. That tells you the attack had changed the mission beyond the hilltop. A firebase exists to support action somewhere else. At Argonne, the fire directed against the base forced action outward from the base. The men on the hill had to hold what they had. Other Marines had to go looking for the source of the pressure. The base had become both a position and a reason for further movement. That is a much different problem from the one at the opening. At the opening, the Marines are simply trying to get back into their places before the firebase takes another hit. Now the question is, how long Argonne can keep functioning if the enemy can continue firing on it from surrounding ground? The morning routine is long gone. The problem has expanded from one interrupted firebase to the terrain around it. Company A eventually seized Hill 1154 northwest of Argonne and destroyed the mortar positions there on March 28th. That is 7 days after the morning the command post was hit. 7 days is a long time to live with a problem that first announces itself in seconds. That is why I do not think the strongest way to tell this story is as a dramatic surprise attack. The surprise was brief. The work afterward lasted much longer. Men had to replace leaders. They had to keep the hill supplied. They had to keep communications going. They had to move casualties. They had to hold sectors. They had to understand that a position could be secure enough to occupy and still not be secure enough to live normally. And then, other men had to go find the ground from which the mortar fire was coming. That is the actual progression. Routine becomes reaction. Reaction becomes organization. Organization becomes evacuation. Evacuation becomes another exposure. And finally, the problem leaves the firebase and moves into the hills around it. The reason I keep using the word routine is that routine is one of the things a combat unit depends on. Routine is not laziness. Routine is how hundreds of little jobs happen without somebody giving a speech every morning. A man knows where he is supposed to be. He knows when chow appears. He knows what radio he listens to. He knows what bunker belongs to his section. He knows who relieves him. He knows what needs to be checked before the day gets busy. On a firebase, that routine is part of the defense. When incoming fire breaks it apart, the unit has to rebuild that invisible system while people are moving under pressure. That is exactly what happened at Argonne. And the command post hit made the problem worse because routine is also built around people. A battalion commander is not just a rank on paper. He is part of how information flows. Remove him suddenly, and the unit has to reroute decisions the same way it might reroute a path across damaged ground. The organization survives by changing shape. That morning, it had no other choice. There is a temptation in war stories to make every man seem instantly ready. Helmet on, weapon in hand, eyes already on the tree line. Real life is not built that way. Men eat, they wash, they move water cans, they look for batteries, they check mail, they carry things, they talk to the radio operator. They walk from one end of a small base to another because somebody asked for something. Then a round lands, and all those ordinary movements become part of the problem. That does not make the men less professional. It is what makes the story human. Professional soldiers still have to get from breakfast to a bunker. A clerk may have to become another rifleman for a few minutes. A Marine who was moving supplies may suddenly become the closest man to a wounded friend. A commander who expected to spend the morning organizing the position may be gone before the organization is finished. The firebase has to absorb all of that and keep working. If you are new to Walter Briggs, that is really what this channel is trying to hold on to. Not just the names of battles, but the jobs inside them. The small practical things that decided whether a unit could keep functioning when the plan broke. If that is the part of Vietnam history you care about, subscribe and stay with us. There are a lot of those stories left to tell. Argonne did not become famous in the way Khe Sanh became famous. Most Americans could not point to it on a map then, and almost none could now. But that is part of why the episode belongs here. A firebase did not need to become a national headline to be the whole world for the men standing on it. On March 21st, 1969, the whole world for those Marines was a hill where the morning had been interrupted. The command post had been hit, wounded men still had to be moved, and the shelling was not finished. Later, when the fighting around Argonne was written into official history, the sequence became clean enough to fit into a few sentences. A mortar attack hit the command post. The battalion commander and 3 other Marines were killed. Additional mortar fire during evacuation killed 3 more. Company C moved to Argonne. Company A moved against the mortar positions. A week later, Hill 1154 was seized, and the mortar positions were destroyed. That is accurate. It is also too clean to show what the morning felt like as a working problem, because the men on the firebase did not experience it as a paragraph. They experienced it as unfinished tasks. A position not yet reached. A radio message not yet passed. A casualty not yet moved. A leader suddenly missing. A helicopter that still had to come in. A sector that still had to be watched. A hill that still had to be held. That is what the mortar rounds interrupted. Not breakfast by itself. The whole machinery of an ordinary morning. And when the shelling finally moved the problem beyond the firebase, the Marines followed it outward into the surrounding ground. There is one detail I wish the official record gave us, and does not. I would like to know what was still sitting where it had been left when the first rounds came in. A coffee cup, a can of sea rations, a helmet on a sandbag, a shirt thrown over a pack. Something completely ordinary. The record does not tell us, so I am not going to invent it. But the absence of that detail says something by itself. History remembers the command post. It remembers the names. It remembers the casualties. It remembers Hill 1154. The little morning objects disappear. For the men who were there, they probably did not. Firebase Argonne was back in Marine hands for less than a day when the mortar fire hit the command post on March 21st. The base had not finished becoming routine again. It never got the chance that morning.